All right. Hello, I am Dr. Maureen Rickman. I'm a psychologist in Madison in private practice. I am a scientist practitioner. And what that means is that in terms of disclosures, I let people know right away that I totally geeked out on this topic. I went way deep and I was like, oh, this is so interesting and so fascinating. So I spent a huge amount of time trying to pull back on all the details about biology and fetal development and evolutionary theory, because I really did want us to end up being able to talk about transgender issues. But I do think what's really critical, especially as psychologists, is that we are scientist practitioners. We do clinical science. We try to understand what helps people, and we want to help people. And that literature comes from, you know what, this is what I do and it works and it's helpful. Tell me more things that work. That's what clinical science is about. Psychological science, by contrast, tries to measure things that are unmeasurable. We measure self-esteem. We measure things like gender. We say there's a difference between, anhedonia and depression. And these immeasurable things are the things that we do that form the basis of psychological science. So when I started thinking about what I'm going to talk about in terms of transgender, I really had to think about the psychological versus the biological differences, because that is our current way of thinking. So the question for today is gender real? Okay? Because you can't answer the question about what do we do or how do we respond to transgender if gender isn't a real thing. Okay? And so the question about gender being real is pretty much, are men and women different? Are men from, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. We have apples and oranges. Okay. Can gender be mixed? All right? Is there such a thing as a person who, is really somewhat of a man and somewhat of a woman, and experiences themselves kind of going back and forth between those things? I think of one of my patients who was about 15 years old, and all of her friends were boys. She liked to do all boy things, and she had, long hair, and she looked very much like a girl in terms of how she presented herself, but she always wears sweatpants. And she would talk about, she just doesn't like girls, she doesn't like girl drama, she wants to be with boys. But she also had this feminine side of her that she said, and sometimes I just want to be pretty. And so sometimes I do get dressed up, and sometimes I be pretty. And if people don't get that, oh well, right? So, is she real? Is that real? Is there really something going on? Is there such a thing as gender fluid? So that's a concept we're going to talk about. Another way to think about gender is, can gender be mixed in sort of this layered way? And this is not a patient, this is a friend of mine who I met when she was 5 and in kindergarten. And she came to kindergarten in her best clothes, which was a boy's suit with a tie with her beautiful long braids. And for the rest of her life, even now that she's in her 20s, she never sticks with anything that would be classically male or female. Man or woman, boy or girl. She's always, she's got so many layers. She essentially is non-binary, is the word that we would use to describe her. Okay. When it comes to the question of transgender, though, we have to think about, can gender be uncovered? All right. Is there such a thing as orangeables? And is there such a thing as apple oranges? All right. And I think about 2 of my patients. It's nice to stay in one town that's fairly small because your patients come back. And so I saw patient number 1 when she was 8 years old, and she had selective mutism. And we pretty much successfully treated the selective mutism. All right. She was able to talk in school. She was able to talk in any situation other than a brand new situation. She'd be very slow to warm up, and she would want to control and decide whether she was going to use her skills to talk in that situation or she was just going to not talk. She came back again at 13 and had figured out that she really, underneath all of this was a boy, and that she wanted to peel off this horrific outer layer of girlness. She didn't like having her period. She didn't want to have breasts. She wanted a double mastectomy. She wanted to start testosterone. She wanted to have a beard because her true identity was underneath this external shell. Right? Very, very different. Interesting though, about the same age that I saw each of them, and they're currently about the same age. I think this one's a little older. This was another young girl who came to my practice because she had pretty bad OCD at 8 years old, okay? And she was washing her hands to the point where they were bloody, and it was just pretty awful. You know, spent a year or so, really treated the OCD, really got it under control. She came in for a booster session at about 11 or 12, and just needed to, because the OCD had come back, and you know, you kind of do different strategies when they're younger versus when they can actually manage their symptoms on their own. And during that course of treatment, I met separately with Mom, and I said, you know, I'm seeing very much of a boy presentation. She's wearing all boy clothes. She's, you know, talking about boy things. She's talking about her friends being boys. Is there any problem that you would have about her, you know, continuing to mature on this path? Do you have any religious things, any, you know, value-based things? And Mom's like, I don't care. I don't care what goes on. She said, you know what? She's our girl. She's our kid. She didn't say girl. She's our kid. You know, I'm fine with that. So she comes back at 14. Okay, again, that sort of 14-year-old age. And she wanted to talk about kind of a relationship thing she was struggling with, because with the OCD, she was getting a little obsessive. She was also getting a lot of social anxiety. And we kind of worked on that gender-neutral way. And, I don't know, 5, 6, 8 sessions, somewhere around there, I kind of just said, you know, by the way, how's it feel, you know, to have breasts, to be menstruating, to be, you know, in a woman's body? And she said, well, I'm a guy. I think everybody knows that. I've been a guy since I was a kid. I really figured out I was a guy when, you know, all my friends are guys. Yeah, everybody does that. I'm a tomboy. Everybody knows that. But then I started getting really weird around girls, okay, in 7th grade. She said, I'm a little better, not so weird around girls now. And I said, okay, well, you know, sometimes when people are adults, and I did use the term adults, people decide that they want to change how their body looks so that the world will experience you as a man, and they will treat you like a man, okay? And she said, I said, do you sometimes now get, you know, people who, you know, mistake you for a boy, and you like that or don't like it? And she said, people are stupid. I said, what? She said, people are stupid. She said, I don't care if they think I'm a man or a woman. I don't care. I'm not going to chop off my boobs because someone doesn't want me, doesn't think it's okay for me to act like a guy. She has a very thin skin of woman around her. She doesn't care. You don't know who she is until you just cut a little deeper. And she's like, I'm a guy. I don't need to change my name. She said, who would want to shave every day? That sounds like such a pain. And you know, and again, this wasn't in one session, this wasn't one conversation, you know, it was broader in sessions. But again, you bring up the menstruation thing and babies, and she's like, who likes having a period? Nobody. She said, yeah, apparently everybody can go on birth control continuously, so I'm trying to talk my mom into that. I'm not gonna chop out my stuff. Okay, so really, when we're talking about gender, and we're talking about transgender, and we wonder about whether gender is real, one of the things you're going to notice as you listen to me is you're going to hear some of your biases, okay? Some people are going to say, you know what? Gender is primarily biologically based. There is sexual dimorphism. Women are smaller. They reproduce by having babies. Men are bigger and heavily muscled. They reproduce by inseminating women. And all of that sort of cascades into the things we know about what it means to be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. And so you're going to hear some biology that says, yeah, it's really more about nature. Then other people are going to be like, you know what, nature is true, but it's just such a small part. It's really about culture. It's really about what world did you grow up in? Why in your culture are only girls allowed to wear skirts? You know, I'm from India. All the men wear long tunics. You know, skirts aren't male or female based on biology. You know, it just depends on where you came from. And we go back and forth with that nature versus nurture. And most of us were raised in that as a dichotomy and a question, okay? But then this other one, we haven't even really studied well, which is free will, okay? The thing that makes us fundamentally human is that we're the only creature on the planet that has true free will, okay? If I am, every fiber of my being, every bit of my conditioning says, you know what? I'm angry, I'm facing a bully. The best way to deal with bullies is to shut them down. I've got the power and the energy to do it. And I can say, you know what? Not today. Walk away, okay? A chimp can't do that, all right? So we have free will. And some people are gonna say, yes, and really gender is all about self-determination. So you're gonna be floating around in these spaces, and that's what I encourage you to do. Because by the end of this lecture, by the end of this talk, you're gonna be like, yeah, it's all about the intersections, okay? So, a little bit of just gender expression. I am very fussy, okay? And I really appreciated our guest speaker our invited speaker for the morning, when he said you get privilege when you think and speak and act inside the box, because I'm an outside of the box kind of person. I do something that and Peter Williamson revealed that I also dance and perform, but one of the concepts we have in dance is you take space, okay? And I'm gonna take a little space here by being very particular and very fussy about using the terms male and female when we're talking about biology, and using the terms boy, girl, man, woman when we're talking about what we mean in our culture about a gender, okay? And I think that's an important distinction, and we'll talk about why that's important as we move along. So gender expression has to do with being feminine, masculine, or androgynous, depending on how your culture defines femininity, masculinity, or androgyny, okay? And so if I dressed up in very fluffy things, and I had my hair all curled up here, and I had flowers in it, and I had makeup on that made my face look very soft, you would think I was dressing in a very feminine way. I'm dressing in pants, boots, and an outfit that a man really wouldn't get away with, but you know, it's more along that lines. Had I put on a suit and even a tie, you would say, oh yes, you're dressing in a very masculine way. So I'm dressing in a pretty androgynous way for our culture. Gender identity is your personal experience of being a boy, girl, man, woman, and you can be non-binary, okay, and all those other things that I showed you, gender fluid, non-binary, but your identity is your personal experience, and it can include rejection of sex-based stereotyping. So, for example, I had another client, and you can tell I'm kind of behavioral therapist, who came in to see me because she was picking herself bloody, okay, down her fingers. And she had her own therapist for real therapy, and she had a couples therapist with her partner. She was a 42-year-old woman, partnered before we had gay marriage to another woman, and I don't know if remember they called themselves married, but they were together for 12 years or something like that. And at the end of our treatment, she said, I kind of want to talk to you about this, but I suppose I need to deal with it with my other therapist. And I said, what's that? She said, I'm a guy. I just feel like I'm a guy. I'm sick of trying to be a woman. And the biggest problem I have is that my partner really loves women. And this is probably going to mess everything up. All right. So she had rejected all stereotypes of what it meant to be a woman. She worked in construction, and yet she lived as a woman, rejecting sex-based stereotypes, and then at some point said, I'm tired of working hard at rejecting sex-based stereotypes. I'd rather be a guy. So then we get to the concept of gender cohesion, all right? And what I mean by gender cohesion is, this is a word that is not included in sort of the popular LGBT, National Institutes of something descriptions about these words, but I like to use this word because it helps me understand things in a more, what I feel is a little more precise way. So gender cohesion is whether you're cisgender, transgender, or genderqueer. And what we mean by that is that your gender identity, your personal experience of being a boy, girl, man, or woman fits with the biology that you have, okay? So if you walk around, even if you reject like 3/4 of the stereotypes for your gender, you know what? I hunt, and this is true for me, I don't hunt, but I fish. Most of my friends in high school were guys, I played pool. I have never felt like I'm a guy, okay? But I reject gender stereotypes profoundly, okay? And I have female biology, so I'm cisgender, okay? There can be someone who is transgendered, like some of those other patients that I talked about, where they feel like their experience does not match their biology. And then genderqueer is those non-binary folks and those gender fluid folks who are like, you know what, it's all over the place. I'm comfortable being me, thinking of myself as very separate from how the world sees me, okay? And my personal experience has not been as a boy, girl, man, woman. My personal experience is very different, so I'm not even gonna get into what I fit with or don't fit with, all right? So, going to the question, is gender based on sex, all right? One thing I want to point out here is this is our, black line, women, men, boys, girls. And the first thing that I noticed when I put this slide together is what I call genderification, all right? Genderification means that you have added something to the biology that really accentuates that there's something besides biology going on. Anybody notice the dress on women? Okay? I do not have hips that are this wide, okay? So if we really think about gender being based on biology, this is what our bathrooms should look like, right? Okay. If you have breasts and a vagina as compared to not prominent breasts and a penis, that's really, if gender was based on sex, that's what our bathroom symbols would look like, okay? But getting back to the idea of sex, being biological sex, there are important hormones that we need to talk about because we're going to talk about sexual development, psychosexual development. And the adrenals are responsible for a whole bunch of stuff, including what I say the A class of hormones, all the anabolic androgens that provide the basis of building up our bodies to be a certain thing, okay? Most of the anabolic androgens that come from the adrenals are specific to the adrenals, androstenedione and a couple other things. DHEA also comes from there, and that's the precursor to all these steroids. But it also produces estrogen and testosterone. And the adrenals have an inside and outside, and they have a catabolic part as well, the glucocorticoids, that's cortisol, adrenaline, all those break down, burn calories kinds of things, all right? You're gonna need to just have a clue about this. You don't need to understand it completely in order to understand psychosexual development. Estrogen, okay, what we think of as the female hormone, is responsible, for fat distribution, where the fat is on the body, breast development, and it is a serotonin enhancer in the brain, okay? It actually goes in there and it's, some people call it a neurotransmitter, some people call it an enhancer, but it affects the brain. Testosterone has to do with height, muscle mass, building up bigger people. That's why testosterone and androgens, adrenal androgens also do that. That's why people take steroids when they're bodybuilders. It also has to do with sexual and territorial aggression, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And I'm sorry on this slide that I use aggression because I actually wanted to change that to assertiveness. I don't like the word sexual aggression. That implies something yucky about men, and I changed it everywhere except I just noticed it on this slide. So, when we're talking about is gender based on sex, we have to understand a little bit about the influences that go into creating a human being at birth. All right, and what I want to point out is just a couple important pieces. Right, one of the first important pieces is that around day 36, the adrenals develop enough that they start secreting huge amounts of DHEA. That gets sent into the system, causes the uterus to generate a lot of estrogen, which forms the basis of creating a placenta, and that continues to differentiate through pregnancy. But this is why pregnant women get morning sickness, okay, because of all the estrogen circulating. When you get to about week 6, all right, actually I should say this here, you have some brain development before you get this. So the cortex-like regions of the brain are beginning to form. You can't have anything affected in utero that isn't present. It's one of the things I talked about upstairs. Fetal alcohol syndrome can't happen to the brain until you have a brain, okay, that's going to be affected by fetal alcohol, by maternal alcohol, all right? And I'm not advocating that, people drink, but I think people shouldn't be told to freak out. You found out, I'm fine, I'm 11 and a half days pregnant and I got trashed twice and my baby's going to die. It's like, no, you're fine. So one of the first things that happens is a process of what's called defeminization. We all start off as biologically destined for a feminine, a female phenotype. And around this time, if you have a Y chromosome, it suppresses the development of the uterus, suppresses the development of the ovaries, and then a few days later, the ovaries start to go on their path and the testes start to go on their path, all right? Now, ovaries generally produce a lot of estrogen, a little bit of testosterone. Testes generally produce a lot of testosterone, a little bit of estrogen, all right? By about day 48, you get another thing happening in the brain. The amygdala starts to differentiate, which is sort of the basis of the HPA axis, and now you have a little being that's vulnerable to stress hormones, okay? And stress hormones coming from the adrenals, but also stress hormones coming from the maternal environment. By about day 55, masculinization starts. The testes are developed enough, they start pumping out testosterone. That high level of testosterone stays for the duration of the pregnancy, and actually it keeps going for a couple of months afterwards, which you get sort of a mini puberty in newborns. And the ovaries secrete estrogen for just a couple days, like, hey, does everything work? Okay, we're done, and then they shut down. They pop up again at birth. You get a little bit of burst of estrogen and a little mini puberty in females as well. But the genitalia are identical until about week 12, all right? This is when people start to have their gender reveal parties, all right? Oh, we finally know what gender the baby is. It's like, you don't know the gender, you know the sex, all right? In fact, you don't know the sex if we're thinking about XX and XY is the sex. What you know is whether it has a penis or not, okay? And that's, we'll get to why that's important in a minute. But then, starting around the second trimester, this is when brain development ramps up. And we have two environments now. We have one testosterone-soaked environment for this developing fetus, and we have another non-testosterone-soaked environment, all right? So what happens at birth is you get the feminization, the masculinization phenotypically, all right? You get the development of the genitals that define being male or female. And if you're a basic XX, you're gonna have a 6 on what's called the Quigley scale in terms of what your genitals look like. If you are an XY, you're gonna have, a 1 or a 2 over here. Now there are these other folks, and this is about 2% of the population, it's a small percentage of the population, who have a different phenotype, okay? Their genitals develop a little differently. And one of them is the triple X folks, okay? Those are females that have an extra X, and they don't really have a lot of difference. They can go from a 6 to a 5 on the Quigley scale. And you can also get an extra X over here, okay? But this is phenotypically a male child, and you might get a little bit more to this side, a less developed penis at birth, okay? You can also get, this is called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Small percentage of the population, XX or XY, do not respond to any androgens anywhere. None from the adrenals, none from testes if they have them, none from the ovaries, even if they are producing special little amounts. And those folks are born looking exactly like these, these people, but when they go through puberty, they get to have a higher score, below 7, because they don't even develop facial hair. They don't even develop they don't develop stinkiness. They don't have any of the biology that's associated with puberty and the testosterone aspects of puberty. We know a lot about these people because they have they're genetically, they present with what looks like a normal vagina and normal or typical genitals, but then when they get to be, you know, reproductive age, they have no uterus. Okay, these we don't have much studies about because these are just they're fertile and they just are, you know, hairy, not very hairy women. Okay, and so these people are the ultra femme model in terms of ultra female, right? Almost no hair. They end up being a little more buxom because they have a little higher level of everything converting to estrogen. Everything that gets put out from the adrenals and gets turned into estrogen. Okay, so those folks are the ultra female. We have another set of folks who are biologically, they have an XX. They have ovaries, but they're insensitive to androgen, or they're over-androgenized. Okay, their adrenals produce huge amounts of androgen in the environment, or the fetal environment includes a lot of androgen from the mother, okay? And when that happens, you get a more male-like genital presentation, all right, at birth. You know, kind of the micropenis, up to the micropenis phenomenon, all right? Yeah?
Could you say the name of some of the syndromes like Klinefelter's associated with Turner syndrome? And so
yeah.
I think the XXX is a supermodel.
Yeah.
Syndrome with a very tall
yeah.
frame.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? I actually preferred to stick with this because I didn't remember all the syndromes because I stuck with this. But you're right. There's Turner's, there's Klinefelter's, there's, you know, there's something called a China doll syndrome. I can't remember. I just, you're right. It's there.
When some are born hermaphroditic, surgeons might make a decision to do something, and they're socially raised a certain way.
Exactly, and we're going to get to that. All right. So then the other thing is we have these partial androgen insensitive folks. They're not all the way over here. They're over here, and they will have undescended testicles. They may have extremely feminine-looking genitals at birth, and then at puberty they have almost typical sexual development, and the testicles will descend and they'll develop an almost normal size penis, an almost typical size penis, and so this is what we do at birth. We assign a gender at birth based on genitals. All right.
Maybe this question will come up later, or maybe it would be better for the previous slide. But when you said that the fetus responds to the circulating hormones in the mother, what happens with twins that are boys and girls so that each one of those are generating their own hormones? Does the hormone of one affect the hormone of the other?
I don't know. That's a good question. But my guess is that if they have two fetal sacs, it won't. The fraternal twins typically have two separate amniotic sacs. I'm guessing there's some occasions when they actually, for some reason, the amniotic sacs merge, and I'm guessing that'd be an interesting population as well.
Because I read like last week or something about girls that have twin brothers tend to be more physically active and
we'll get to, yes. Yep. We'll get all,
than other girls, and also do less. Was it interesting? They do less well in school because they act like boys, and people don't like that. But also they do less well in their work environment because their assertiveness is not accepted,
right.
And so they're sort of punished on both ends.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's the big question that we're getting to is why does that happen and what contributes to it. One of the things just quickly about this scale, all right? Did anybody notice it's backwards? Okay? Because this is a 0 and you get masculinized. The 7 should be on the other end, just saying. Okay? But here's the data in your handout about the differences in sexual development. So one of the questions you have is, you know, children are born, we genderfy them immediately, we put pink clothes on them and blue clothes on them, we say we're having a boy, we're having a girl, we name them. Some people don't do that, but what happens between birth and 4, okay? How does the child learn to be a person, all right? And what we have during this age is we have contagion learning, all right? We have empathic emotional connections, and we have mostly parallel play. And what we mean by that is the brain of this child doesn't quite get that other people can see them or know them, But what they do get is, I know that you're like me, you're a person, and I'm going to be doing what you do. I tried to get it up and I couldn't find it because it was on Facebook, but this picture of these 4 infants. They were like a year, just a little over a year old. I'm sure they were in seats, and one of them started rocking and laughing, and the other 3 babies started rocking, and some of them started laughing, and then the other ones were trying to rock, and it wasn't that fun. But then the other 2 would be laughing, and then they'd go back, all right, and they'd try to get that laughing thing. That's what we mean by contagion learning, all right? So toddler gender expression is all over the place, okay? You let a child who's under 4 pick up clothes and put them on and do dress up, and this is what they do, okay? You know, this little darling over here, she's got like the cool green muscular thing like Hulk in a tutu. This little one is Jimi Hendrix, okay? I don't know if that's a boy or girl. Similarly, we have, you know, a captain for an airline pilot. I don't know if that's a boy or girl. I just was looking up costumes and was like, can you tell? Is that a boy or girl? How do you know? This pair, though, is a girl and a boy. That hair is that boy cut where they do the mohawk up here, and mom curled it for him so that he would look like a princess. Okay, so toddler gender expression is not gender expression. All right. Between 4 and 7, we develop the theory of mind. We develop perspective taking. Empathy, which is contagious, develops into sympathy, which is intention. Okay, when I am 4 and I look at you and you're crying, I cry because I feel the way you feel. Okay, when somewhere between 4 and 7, and it's a developmental path, it's not a switch, I start to realize that if you're crying, you feel sad, and I don't have to feel sad. I can just figure out that I might want to comfort you, okay? And that's intentional sympathy, and that's a higher level of emotional connection.
And some people say that's a central deficit in autism, that they lack theory of mind.
Exactly, exactly. And then you can see why people with autism aren't lacking emotionality. They just, if they're feeling it, they're living it, and they don't quite understand why nobody else would understand it. Of course I'm raging. This place is too loud. You know, don't you all get that? And it's like, well, don't you know what you look like to the rest of us? No, they don't, right? Fantasy play emerges, and that's when you see social role play starts to emerge, and that's when you see some gender role play, all right? And if you can imagine what it's like to begin with contagion learning, and then slowly from, 3, 4, all the way up to 7, try to figure out where I should be and how I fit, we do have a huge gentrification issue that happens, all right, about who gets to be a person and who has to be a girl, all right? I looked up superhero costumes for kids. Okay, this is what came up. Boy, 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 boy. I had to look up costumes for girls, superhero costumes for girls. Now you put a skirt on it, you make it prettier, you make sure it's pink. If you're a girl, you don't get to be a person. You first have to be a girl, then you can think about being a person. All right, so kids grow up in this world. Occasionally, and this is, I think, happening more and more, we start to get parents who say, you know what? Your favorite Scooby-Doo person is Daphne, okay? You think Daphne is the coolest? You get to dress like Daphne for Halloween. So this little boy dressed as Daphne for Halloween, all right? This little darling wanted to be an elf warrior. I have no idea, girl, boy. This is a great elf warrior. You can't tell, all right? What does an elf warrior look like? There's no gentrification there. So one of the things that we have to ask is, are there sex-based differences in childhood? Are there really things that are based on biology, based on what's going on? And there's 2 hypotheses that get a lot of play right now, and one of them is the model that girls, even though they're not sexually reproductive before age 7, they are already starting to show signs of this tendency to tend and befriend, all right? I need to make connections with people, I need to tend and befriend, and boys are already starting to show behaviors of throwing and fighting and learn to stand your ground, okay? And people observe play, and they observe things, and they do studies of like, look, kids come at 4.5 years old, The girls are better at talking, the boys are better at the visual spatial tasks. Come on, we already know childhood sex-based differences are real. The problem with that data is that when you actually do any intervention, give 4-year-old boys more reading time, 4-year-old girls more visual spatial tasks, the differences disappear. Okay? Not very strong biological basis, okay? Also, if you start thinking about what happens, I was talking about, you know, kids are looking out at the world from 3 and 4 and then moving on. Guess what happens if you hand someone a pink wrapped baby? All right? Oh, you pretty little thing, smile at me, you are so darling. Ooh, can you coo, can you coo? Okay? Hand someone a blue wrapped baby. Okay? Ooh, here you go, buddy. Grab the keys, come on, grab the keys. All right? Where is the gentrification happening? Okay? Is it because it's biologically based? Good research to show that there's not a lot of biological differences. If you put a loose pair of shorts on a kid, there's no biological differences, all right? Not before age 9 or 10. And the testosterone levels, absolutely on average the same, okay? From 6 to 9 years old, girls are not different than boys. The kinds of things that we say are different, oh, there's more rough and tumble play, and boys are more aggressive, and everybody knows testosterone is related to aggression. There is one difference, and again, I'm not saying nothing is biologically based, because if you're over here with me like, oh, it's culture, it's gentrification, and I'm going to jump you over here, there's something to do with nature. This group of boys, okay, these 3 boys out of this population sample are outliers, all right? They have high testosterone. They are more aggressive. They are more active, all right? And you can imagine a world where if your 5-year-old girl is sitting on the playground and she's wearing a pretty dress and you say, honey, no, you can play on the slide, but I don't want you playing in the mud. Do not go over there, okay? But if you have a boy saying, you know what, why don't you go play with those boys? They're throwing sticks in the water. You go play with them. So if you have a population of outlying boys that are different than girls, you can see where gentrification would really push a whole bunch of boys to that, especially if you've also got the superhero costumes going on and everything else. So the other place to look biologically isn't just in those hormone differences, but also are there sex-based brain connectivity differences. One of the things we know about androgens in utero, in life, all the way until you're a grown-up, is that they do cause a high level of overconnectivity and myelination. The brain gets overconnected too early. And when you get myelin squeezing around and developing neuron, it doesn't have as many options to develop. And so in utero, in early childhood, if you have too much androgen, too much testosterone, whether it's from the fetal adrenals, whether it's from the fetal testes, whether it's from the maternal hormones, you're going to get an overmyelination and you're going to get some limitations. And that really does account for a lot of the LD, ADHD, ASD kind of things we see as higher rates in boys, all right? But functional differences in connectivity don't hold in children, in neurotypical children. So when we say, well, women have more intuition because they have more flexibility in connecting things in their brain, things didn't hook up and get rigid too soon, you actually do those studies and it just doesn't hold water, okay? And also because the myelination continues through puberty, it really is not a very powerful argument that there's real biological basis difference. The other thing is, I'm just gonna harken back for just 30 seconds to my dissertation. I did a dissertation that I didn't keep going in the scientific world, but my research has come back a couple times, and my mentor just recently put it out there in the general population, that basically, even something as extreme that we think is as real and biological as shyness, which we can find correlated with the HPA axis, the fight or flight response system in the brain, creates shyness. We studied 2.5-year-olds, okay? And we saw really shy children, and their brains and their physiology looked like shy children. We studied them at 4, and the shy ones looked shy, the bold ones looked bold, except for the ones that changed. So yeah, you expect some of the shy kids to not be so shy, some of the bold kids to not be so bold. regression to the mean, but still the findings real. By the time they got to me at 7 and 8, you couldn't tell who was shy or bold. Everything changed. But what was really cool is the physiology changed with the behavior. So if you were a shy kid at 2, 4, or 7, okay, no matter where you started, your brain physiology tended to look like a shy kid. And you could change all over the place, but the brain and biology changed together. And I do think that's an important thing to think about when we think about, is it nature, is it nurture, or how does it interact? So I just wanted to spend a moment here on childhood gender impression. When we think about the genderification phenomena, we do get stuck in this situation where we say, hey, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't genderify children so much. Maybe we should just let them be free, you know? This is the perfectly gender-free child, all right? Mom, dad, whomever is just allowing this kid to have lots of fun, all right? I don't know if that's a boy or a girl, but that is a great haircut, all right? This little guy is a guy, never had a haircut, 4 years old, all right? Not genderified as a girl, just never wanted to cut his hair, okay? Here's very clearly genderification, all right? Here is cultural differences in gender. This little guy gets teased because he wears earrings and braids. He's Native American. That's consistent with his culture, all right? And then this one, this is a girl who shaved her head, not because of cancer. And one of the things that I also thought about yesterday after the speaker was, why do we freak out about gender? Why do some people say, well, I would never allow my kid to be like that. Or I'm not gonna let my 7-year-old, my 8-year-old shave her head. I wouldn't let my boy do that. No one gets to shave their head. But one of the things that was brought up yesterday that I thought was really interesting is that the privilege of being in the box, the privilege and power that goes with conformity is one that parents are terrified will not be given to their children if they encourage or allow for non-typical development, all right? So, gender sameness hypothesis. This was one of the things that I learned when I was in grad school with Janet Hyde. She's, brilliant feminist gender studies professor who, when she proposed the gender sameness hypothesis, she got a lot of pushback. Then people started to say, well, really, she's kind of right. And now people are saying, well, there's a couple of things where she's not right. But when we measure, and I'm going to just make sure I get all of these correct, because I'm missing some of the things I want to talk about. Personality, cognitive ability, leadership, every time we measure one of those things, one of those psychological phenomenon, when we find a difference between men and women, it's so small that it's a difference that makes no difference, right? The only place that a difference makes a difference is sexual assertiveness, okay? And we're gonna talk about that. Post-puberty, we start talking about these hormones. Estrogen, okay? Maybe estrogen has effects after puberty. Maybe testosterone has effect after puberty. Maybe there's no childhood differences, but these two hormones are powerful. They powerfully affect how we think and behave. Gender differences are real, they're just later in life, okay? Andronarch is when 9 and 12-year-olds get the stinky feet and the hairy armpits. 11 to 18, you get menarch for girls, seminarch for boys, and this is where you get the social sexual identity development, all right? Before this, kids might have crushes, they may have a sense of romance, but really social bonding is pretty innocent. But when you get to be a teenager, social bonding gets very sexy, okay? And you start to see, what's sexy here? What's sexy to you? What's sexy over here? And all of a sudden we have this other layer of stuff. And the hypothesis about, the biological hypothesis about why that would matter in terms of gender is that mate selection matters, okay? Gender comes from women needing to present as this ultra femme who has a thin waist, meaning I'm fertile, I'm not pregnant yet. Wide hips, meaning I'm fecund and I can give birth to a live child, okay? I have ample bosoms, I can nurse babies, and I have a very delicate face, so I'm not gonna challenge you, okay? And then males, all right, are wide-shouldered, heavy biceps, ungirded legs, no skirts or things messing it up so they can chase things, and they have that constant angry face because it looks powerful and aggressive. right? So this is where the mate selection idea says, that's where all these gender differences come from. That's why we have, you know, different types of jobs and different types of clothes, as you can kind of see in mate selection, that the feminine ideal is obvious in the clothing we choose for women. Heavy biceps, long necks, broad wide shoulders and big arms, okay? Extra big lip, all right? De-emphasis of the waist and bosom, okay? There is no feminine ideal that's biologically based. Similarly, masculine ideal, okay? Big wide hip clothes, okay? Super straight, very encumbering kind of skirts, okay? Messiness, okay, you can't run, fight, or throw in that, but I love this outfit. I actually want that one. And then, of course, you know, over here. So masculine ideal, feminine ideal doesn't really come from, in terms of gender expression, does not come from biology. So maybe it's not gender expression, maybe it's about behavior. So if we look at adolescent sexual behavior, we see that homosexual behaviors are not uncommon, 20 to 40% of teenagers, adolescents, and I shouldn't just say teenagers, adolescents, because adolescence goes into early 20s. We get a pretty high amount of homosexual behavior. We do see testosterone-related sexual activation in both genders, okay? The more testosterone kind of circulating, the more testosterone response you have, the more likely you are to be sexually assertive. And monogamy has not really developed yet, okay? There's sort of like levels of like, well, we're a thing, but we're not a thing, but we can do this, but not that. And then there's something else that happens, and I think this is really important to think about in terms of sexual development, psychosexual development. And I coined the term idiosexuality based on the idea that at some point you fall in love with a person, okay? And then your sexual energy is directed toward that person. And when you fall in love, whether it's long-term, short-term, a whole bunch of things happen in terms of your sense of self. If you fell into love with one kind of person, all right, and it makes you feel just right, you're much more likely to again fall in love with another person that's a lot like that, okay? And falling in love is really not about sexual behavior. It's not about reproductive sexual behavior. Go ahead and, you know, think about the one sexual behavior that reliably produces children. Okay, got it in your head? All right. Now think of just 2, 3, 6, 12, 37 things that you would count as sexual that are not reproductively based. Okay? We've got this little bitty thing in here, and then this whole big thing in here. All right? So idiosexual, and then, so now what I want you to do is as you think about those other sexual behaviors, okay, could those happen with different biology? Okay, and I'll just share one that you know, hit me when I was 15 pretty hard. Peggy's mom accidentally said, "Oh, just rub up and down my arms and I'll do anything for you." And I went, "Oh, I don't want to know about her sex life." Okay, what if her husband didn't want to rub up and down her arms? Okay, would that end the marriage? Okay, would he find a different way to really get sexual with her? Probably. All right, there isn't a set of sexual behaviors that are like, oh, here's the deal breakers, babe. You know, and sometimes there are some deal breakers. Sometimes like, yeah, you know, that's not, I just can't even fall in love with you if that's going to be part of our relationship. So the thing I wanted to point out about these particular things that I picked out is, again, cross-cultural differences. All right, typical, like this is our classic Western model, even though this is a Jewish couple, which some people think of not Western because it's Middle Eastern. These two are two men, okay? These are clearly men. They were in tuxedos, gender expression is men. They're in love with men, okay? These two guys, obviously they're male. I'm not sure how much this is a masculine gender expression because I don't know that culture very well. Kind of guessing it's kind of masculine, but not super masculine. Certainly not hyper masculine like this. Okay, and also he's the taller one. So I'm not sure the gender identity over here. These two are both women, okay? And this woman has gender expression that's very feminine. This woman has gender expression that a part of it is very masculine, but she's very into the long hair and the curly things. And so she's got a mixed gender expression, but she's probably very clearly identifies as a woman. Right? So I fell in love with a woman here, these two women both fell in love with very womanly women, okay, very feminine women. Up here, okay, very tall, very big, very powerful bride, and a smaller, thinner man. Idiosexuality, you fall in love with a person, you don't fall in love with parts. And when that happens, and this is the phenomena that I think is interesting, is that sex generates bonding, all right? Arranged marriages are just as satisfying as the ones we select. And when you have sex, you bond with your partner and you become engaged in an idiosexual relationship. Gender identity stabilizes after falling in love, okay? 98% of people identify as cisgender, at least historically. And when you were in that adolescent phase of exploring, you hadn't fallen in love, you hadn't had that experience, you didn't know where you fit, and no one should have asked you about your gender identification because it could end up being anything. A monogamous identity also emerges, okay? About 90% of people identify themselves as monogamous. All right, 10% say nope, non-consensual monogamy. If you want to be my partner, I'm gonna have other partners sexually. And that's important because an identity is different than a set of behaviors, all right? One of the most monogamous identifying cultural phenomena we have is getting married. Okay, we make all these promises of fidelity, and I'm gonna wear your ring, and then everybody's gonna know I got my ring on, and you got your ring on, and I'm yours and you're mine, and no one touches us, okay? But 50% of marriages have infidelity. Sexual behavior is not the same as identity. You can identify as monogamous and still not be monogamous. The other thing is that historically, monogamous identity has been somewhat lower among homosexual men and both male and female bisexual people identify as bisexual. And so again, it's like lower, 60 to 85% will say we are monogamous, all right? So there's a higher consensual non-monogamy in that population. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with marriage in the...
Yeah. Do you think there's a significant change in current generations, you know, who so many endorse polyamory, you know?
I think it's coming from early sexualization. I think it's asking people to identify who they are and what they are when they're 14. But we can talk more about that when we get to that. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I want to point out about the idiosexual identity is that a homo and bisexual identity, okay, it's only 10% of the population. Adolescence, including into your 20s, late adolescence, is 20 to 40% of the population in terms of behavior. So again, you get an identity, psychosexual identity, solidified, but that doesn't account for transgender identity, which is like 1.7%. We used to think that's what it accounted for. It's like, oh, well, you know, if you're gay, then it's because you want to be a man, and that's why you want to be with a man, because you know, your woman wants to be with a man, and then that's why you're transgender, but that's not really it at all. Monogamy is a choice, not a feeling, okay? Just putting those clinical things out there. So maybe it's not about mate selection, maybe it's about reproductive fitness. And I just want to go over this briefly. Again, I always think that I'm gonna have enough time, and I never do. We're going right to noon though, right? Yeah, okay. The theory of reproductive fitness is not about mate selection, okay? It's about once you have a mate and form a family and form a tribe and form a group, how as a group do you keep populating and expanding and keeping your group alive, all right? So the theory of reproductive fitness is an evolutionary biological theory of gender, okay, if that makes sense. Evolution produced these patterns of gender roles because they're reproductively successful. So one of the classic gender roles is that the woman is there, she's vulnerable, she's probably pregnant, she has a little toddler and a baby girl that can't run very fast, so she needs to run to the back of the cave, hole up, and get into a protective mode when there's threat and danger, okay? The man, the masculine provider, who is physically stronger, on the other hand, is going to fight off all those attacks, okay? Stand at the front of the cave and fight everybody off. So that fight or flight response is actually a threat response that doesn't have to do with reproduction, right? It has to do with reproductive fitness. If you can get all the females fleeing into a safe spot and all the males fighting, okay, because they're better at it, then you're going to get a genderification that makes sense evolutionarily, okay? And And again, these are the sort of details of that. One of the things that I want to point out, though, is that, and again, reading Janet Hyde's work, she originally said, and she was just obviously a very broad reader, she said, you know, one of the other gender things that keeps coming up again and again is throwing. Little boys throw better, boys throw better, teen boys throw better, men throw better. And it's like, oh, that makes great sense. Again, now we have the theory of reproductive fitness. It's not about mate selection. It's about whoever you mate with, be idiosexual, pick someone else, but save them if there's a threat. That's what happens. And what I want to point out about that is, love it when people do challenging research 20 years after this theory's out there. Someone did a handball study, okay? Handball is the European model of handball. And you have to throw, boom, a ball really hard. Accuracy is huge. Power is also huge, but not that huge, because accuracy is what's huge. And they studied people who, starting at a young age, became expert at handball through adulthood and became expert at handball. And lo and behold, there are no gender differences in throwing either, okay? We're going to talk a little bit more about throwing when I get to evolutionary theory, because I want to add one more piece to the reproductive fitness, because I think this is also important, because again, it's not just about mating, it's also, actually, I'll come back to the next thing. I will talk about this right now because it's the place. So that stress reactivity difference is one where people said, okay, this is where we're going to find the difference. It's not in the sexuality, it's not in the mate selection. Gender differences are happening in stress reactivity. And so the amygdala is smaller in women. So the amygdala has less options for how to react to stress. And the problem with that is that when you correct for body size, the correlation drops. Also, remember when we said in utero, when you expose a developing fetus to high levels of cortisol, you're going to get differences in the development of the fight or flight response that are based on multiple things, okay? And you get that effect at all ages. The amygdala size differences occur in both sexes. You're more likely to have PTSD if you have a small amygdala. But you also have the amygdala grow and shrink, okay, depending on what stresses you experience. So it really becomes this stress response thing starts to really lose its biological basis when we study it with any power. We do also see that testosterone, though, is specifically related to territorial threats, okay, and to sexual activation assertiveness. And so there is something about the testosterone that does make males, it's a hard hormone to fly, especially if you're, a 13-year-old boy. You get these surges, you do have a higher level of aggressiveness. And then is the amygdala responding differently based on your testosterone? And actually that's where the gender differences in amygdala and threat response start to fall down, in that after puberty, it's the surge in testosterone that predicts how much willing you are to be standing at the front of the cave and fighting someone off. And it doesn't end up, it's the surge rather than the baseline level. And again, the gender differences start to break down there. Not to say that men aren't better at fighting off people at the front of the cave, but you may have noticed, I don't know, anybody have to fist fight somebody or take down a saber-toothed tiger lately? I mean, most of our protection comes from weapons, guns, and phones. Hey, I need help here, okay? So the other part that I want to talk about with reproductive fitness is the idea of group fitness, okay? Because why would we bother to have 10% of our society be homosexual and not reproductive? Okay, that sort of doesn't make sense if you're going to be a species that wants to take over the whole planet. And yet, you look across species and there's lots of homosexual bonding behaviors, okay? And why would that be? Why would evolution preserve that? And basically the idea of group fitness theory is to say that when we think about that big circle of non-reproductive sexual behaviors and then that little reproductive part, non-reproductive sexual behaviors increases social bonding, okay? The more cohesive you are as a group, the better things go, okay? Culturally, we don't, do a lot of sexual things in this particular culture, but if you're a bonobo chimp, everything good ends up being, having a little sexual pleasure associated at the end of it. But the theory also says that any low-producing or non-reproducing humans, if they contribute to the group, are adding to the overall fitness. And homosexual identity, if you identify as a homosexual, then you're going to reduce the competition for resources in large families. There's some data to suggest that the later born boys who have more brothers are more likely to identify as homosexual as adults, okay? And that kind of goes with that, I'm not going to compete for resources, because there was a time in history before birth control where it would be typical to have, I think the natural amount is you can have like 11 to 15 children during your reproductive life, and counting on some of them dying out, families used to be larger, but this homosexual identity seems to say, hey, we don't want everybody to reproduce. There's not enough resources for every mating couple to have 13 children, and then 13 more, and then 13 more, and then 13 more. So the other concept I want to introduce is the concept of an endophenotype, okay? And basically, the kith and kin fitness theory with the overall the kith and kin fitness theory is a subset of the overall reproductive fitness theory, is that an endophenotype is different than a phenotype. When you're an XX, your biology generates this way, you end up with a female body. An XY is a male body, that's called phenotype. But an endophenotype is when external influences, such as what uterine environment you were raised in, or whether the egg that started you or the sperm that started you had certain methylations, certain genes turned on and off based on what happened when that parent was walking around in the world, those create differences in what's going to be expressed that are not straight line genetics, okay? And those are what we get, and many of you may have heard and taught the diathesis stress model, that you can have an underlying biological diathesis that maybe, you are prone to aggressive behavior in response to threat because you're very testosterone sensitive, but you just don't get a lot of threat in life, so you don't look that different, okay? So that's where endophenotypes sort of maximize the variability in human development. And this is where I do need to spend, again, geeking out, being a bit nerdy, but it's really important to understand evolution, all right? The way that most people are taught evolution is that it's always happening, we're ever changing, we're ever evolving, and it's, biological forces are creating, this great big universe, this great big world of diversity, and who's ever going to be the fittest is going to survive. And when we think about what happened in human evolution, alrighty, and how we have these theories that really humans evolved because we had hunters, and men became the hunters and women became the gatherers, or humans evolved because we could throw better, all right? The thing that you need to start with is an understanding that if this is an evolutionary tree, okay, and this is some kind of ancestor, this would be the hominids, okay? Anything that gave rise to the great apes, anything that gave rise to humans is sort of this part of the branch. If let's see, these are the same. If over here, okay, all these creatures ended up being great apes, okay, and these creatures ended up being Homo sapien, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis. When you think about what happens here that is going to make evolution happen is you are not going to get oh, I'm a human and now I'm going to be a better human, okay? Basically the way evolution happens is that down here there was some advantage for this group to branch off and become Homo because they could take over a whole bunch of territory. They could take over, exploit the environments that they were in, and then the only surviving hominins that could make it were the ones who could find their own little niche, okay? The baboons and the chimps and the bonobos, they could make it, okay? But all the variability that happened there could not, all right? And so we call that endpoint specialization. And when you have endpoint specialization, you actually get an exploitation of all the other forms of mateable variability, all right? And so all the different ways that Homo could mate with other variations on Homo, when humans evolved, it became an endpoint specialization. So that's what I want to show you here, all right? Hairless bipedal hominins emerged. This is the branch that separates us from great apes. Hominins versus hominids. Hominids down here. Okay, we have a shared branch of hominids. They go over there, they become great apes. We're hominins, we come up here. All right, we're hairless, but bipedal. We don't brachiate, we don't swing anymore. And that makes us better at throwing spears, all right? Evidence 2 million years ago, hairless bipedal homo things had ambush hunting, they had rudimentary stone tools. About 400,000 years ago, we can show evidence that Homo, some version, some variation, were better at hunting with spears than chimps. Chimps do hunt with spears, okay? They throw this way, okay? They're not very accurate, they don't have a lot of force. We throw this way, we're more accurate, we have more force, all right? If throwing spears and hunting was the thing that drove human evolution, that drove Homo sapien evolution, gotta say, it took a while. Because then, 300,000 years ago, we have tons of variations on Homo, okay? 280,000 years ago, Neanderthals and Denisovans are taking over other parts of the world. They're wearing tanned furs, they're going off to cold parts, Asia, they're leaving Africa and going off to Asia, all right? They're doing something, we still don't have Homo sapien yet. Finally, 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged. And what did we do to increase our reproductive fitness? We gave birth to the most vulnerable little creatures ever, okay? I'm gonna show you this picture. Oh, here it is. Oh, how do I go back? Oh, anybody know how to go backwards on these things? Shift backwards? Don't escape. All right. All right. That's a newborn baby gorilla. All right? Imagine being a breastfeeding hominin. It's like, go ahead, babe. You hang on. All right? This is a toddler for a chimp. Imagine, you can just go throw a toddler on your back. It's like, okay, I'm gonna go climb trees, I'm gonna do some hunting, okay? We have to carry even our toddlers. We have to have our bigger kids carry our babies, all right? What did we do? We, I don't know why, gave birth to the most vulnerable creatures on the planet. And somehow that made a huge difference, okay? And this is important for gender, okay? Because what happens around here 170,000 years ago? Lysis studies suggest that we finally started making clothes. These folks made tan furs, okay? Very possible. It's hard to have a baby carrier made out of a tan fur. They had a different body structure. They were heavier. Their babies may have been able to cling to the fur. Yeah.
And cranial capacity increased from Homo erectus to like Homo sapiens to have bigger brains.
Exactly. So this giant brain happens. We give birth to this very vulnerable infant. We have to carry it around. How is that an advantage? And it's an advantage because we do things like we start solving problems. And what do you do with the vulnerable infant? We develop clothes, and then it took a while. We start flourishing, we migrate through the whole globe, and then we do that thing that I talked about. We mated or beat out or ate away the food of every other kind of creature that was on the hominin path. We took over the whole planet, all right? And so all these other ones are interbred into extinction. And so are men hunters, okay? Well, throwing capacity is not gender-based. Sharp-pointed spears immediately reduced the gender gap in throwing force, okay? That was way back there in history, right? That was pre-Homo, okay? If you can get a sharp spear, you don't need a lot of force, you know, to get that little, you know, pica that's kind of walking along like a pig on the ground. They did not really seem to provide an evolutionary advantage for Homo sapiens, all right? 2 million years ago, they were hunting with spears, okay? And then testosterone seems to be unrelated to hunting, all right? Chimp studies, they don't don't get testosteronized when they're hunting. They do when they're doing their perimeter check. They do when there's females around that are potentially mateable, but it doesn't seem related to hunting. All right, and then are women gatherers? All right. Well, infant vulnerability severely restricts all activity in reproducing women. Okay, and that's carrying babies. I mean, that's self-protection. That's gathering. That's hunting. Alrighty. So the first wave of feminism was probably developing some baby carriers so that you could close that gender gap. All right. And that's where, if you think back to that first picture that I showed you, the clothes with the African woman who had the big lip, okay, because that's culturally beautiful. All right, the other thing is she was wearing, her clothing was a baby sling, all right? And she had an infant there, and she can throw a spear, and she can gather, and she can protect herself. So now that you're going through this, you say, wow, there is some biology, obviously. Seems to be mostly testosterone. Seems to be a little bit of the sexual dimorphism, but not powerful. There's a lot of culture. Cultural evolution, the ability to create things, make things, solve problems, really took over gender in historical times, okay? This hunter-gatherer notion, yes, maybe we can prove it. There's agriculture arising and things like that. But again, agriculture arises, all right, men and women side by side. Women can't be gatherers or do agriculture without a baby in a sling, okay? So then the last piece is, how much time have we spent here on self-determination? Not a lot. In fact, most of us weren't raised to even say that. It's nature or nurture, nature or nurture. But human beings are thinking creatures. We don't have homosexual behavior and say, oh, I had one homosexual experience, I am therefore gay. No, it's an identity development, right? You don't have one failure at monogamy and go, okay, I'm polyamorous, you know? Identity has to do with how you choose, how you define yourself. And that's where we get these adorable, gotta say, adorable gender nonconforming children. That friend that I talked to you about, this was her, okay? It's like long hair, clothes, not boy clothes, clothes you can't tell what's going on, all right? And what do they have to tell us? One of the things about gender nonconforming children, and I'm not saying teens, children, they're not necessarily gender dysphoric, all right? But 5 to 15% of girls and 2 to 6% of boys are presented for treatment for gender dysphoria prior to puberty. And I say presented for treatment because they're brought into someone's office and says, you know, she dresses like a boy, she acts like a boy, and she just wants to be a boy. What is gender dysphoria in a 9-year-old? Are we assessing that well? Well, I don't like my body. I want to be a boy. Is that really gender dysphoria in a meaningful way when you're 9? Okay. Transgender social identity prior to puberty does increase your persistence into adulthood. So there is also a part that if you are a gender nonconforming child, you are more likely to emerge into adulthood that way. And anybody want to guess the ratios? Is it like 90% of transgender children will become, you know, transgender as adults, or not gender nonconforming children will become transgender as adults? Is it 4%? Is it 50%? What's your guess? Any guesses?
Okay.
Well, puberty is associated with the greatest change, okay, not gender nonconforming behavior. Homosexual or bisexual identity emerges at higher rates among these kids. Older adolescents. Male gender nonconforming children are less likely to identify as a transgender woman regardless of their sexual orientation. So you get about 60% of, I want to be a girl, I want to be a girl, I want to be a girl. Say, I got a penis, I like it, I like my testosterone. I'm gonna stick with being a boy, I'm gonna desist with being a girl. The females are more likely to identify as transgender men, okay? And sexual orientation does predict that, and that's where you kind of see the testosterone effect. So about 60% of girls who say, I'm a boy, I want to be a boy, I want to live like a boy, I want to be known to the world as a boy, about 60% of them are persisting in that. The overall statistic, not surprising, is 50%. Falling in love, that idiosexuality, tends to stabilize the psychosexual identity, and that I think is really critical for understanding stuff. is there anything we can glean from looking at those DSD children? And I should explain this because my husband's a teacher and he always says I go too fast and I don't explain all my words and I get too excited. DSD, okay, differences in sexual development, is what I described as those, on that Quigley scale of differences in phenotype at birth. And these are the intersex children. That used to be the word intersex. It's less than 2% of the population, but they have important information about how biological psychosexual things are, such as gender identity and sexual orientation. And in the XY girls, those complete androgen insensitive girls, they were identified as girls, their gender assignment at birth was girls, they were raised as girls, they have they're not masculinized in puberty. Again, this is one small study, but none of them reported gender dysphoria. They don't have a uterus, but they are not feeling gender dysphoria. And they have the highest self-reported rate of heterosexuality, 100%. That's just about boys, okay, just about men, all right? The partial XY girls, this is where the testicles descend at puberty. Most of them are identified as girls at birth, okay, because they don't have external testicles. But then when they do emerge, usually, meaning more than half of the time, in fact, it was hard to read the data, even more than half the time, they do transition to being men at puberty. They seem like they really want to be identified as men. And they're usually heterosexual, meaning that they now have male parts, and they want to be in relationships with people with female parts, with women. Okay? Androgenized girls, these were the ones who had that intersex masculinization of their genitals, have higher rates of homosexual and bisexual fantasies. And I don't know, I couldn't quite get like how old this study was, how many other studies are like this, because they don't have higher rates of homosexual or bisexual behaviors. And it's like, yeah, but some people say, well, maybe it's just not, it's underreporting. Maybe they really are, but they only have slightly higher rates of that. The rate of gender dysphoria is much higher risk, okay? Gender dysphoria in the general population of girls, 0.3. Theirs is 5% of them are gender dysphoric. But they still are not that gender dysphoric, okay? And the small sample size, there was just one study where there was sort of that presence all the way of sort of a micropenis, and those boys got assigned, those females got assigned a boy gender at birth and were raised as boys. They had no gender dysphoria into manhood. They had the physical changes. I'll see what my next one is. So I'm just gonna put this, skip for a second. All right. So one of the things I want to say about that, and again, this is kind of going outside the box, is we have decided, we meaning the general population has decided that the word transsexual is not a very good word and we should use gender affirming treatment. And I have a problem with that because when we think of biology as being sex-based, if you do something to your biology to change it, you are to make female parts look more male or male parts look more female, you are changing your sexual phenotype. You are a transsexual, okay? But just like my apple orange, okay, you can be strongly transgendered with no desire whatsoever to be transsexual, all right? And I think that's a very important thing to think about as well, all right? And I was very careful about that, and I you know, I kind of, we had someone come into our clinic to talk to us about gender and transgender and all these issues. And whenever I would press her on something like this, she would push back really hard. The language is gender affirming treatment. And it's like, well, let's just say a transsexual treatment, because, you know, these CAS, these boys who were, you know, androgen insensitive, they have a masculinization surgical procedure, and they are now transsexualized, okay? They have had an XX, they've been transsexualized, and they are now identifying as a man. Those same population who did not have any transsexual surgery and identified as women are women, but the ones who didn't bother, if they identify as men, they're still men, right? They're still walking around the world. You know what? You don't get to know what's going on in here, okay? Everything else, I look like a woman, right? And that, I think, is an important part about understanding transsexual versus transgender. Come on. So now we're going to go back to, we've got just a few minutes left, and I think I'm doing good here. Is transgender identification on the rise in Europe and North America? These studies are studies done in other countries. I had to find them, Sweden, Finland, places where they have good medical records and nationalized health. The historical presence of transgender identity is about 0.5% of the population. Adolescent gender dysphoria is more than doubled in current times. We're at 1.3%. Historically, males sought transgender affirming treatment in adulthood 3 times the rate of females, okay? So again, this was a transgender treatment because they identified as men. They became transgender males became transsexuals. Transgender affirming treatment centers now treat equal proportion of male and female. Okay. Adolescent onset transgender identification. This is our real quagmire. This is what we face as clinicians. We get people coming in and saying, you know, I like, you know, my orange apple, okay? We don't remember her ever acting like a boy or wanting to be in boy clothes. I mean, nobody in our family dresses up for anything. I don't remember her playing with princess stuff, but, you know, we didn't play with, you know, we didn't play football either. We were just kind of a low-key family. There was no history of gender differences. She was not a gender non-conforming child. And then they say, so now why is she suddenly wanting to just strip off all this female biology? And the population that is transgender identified is very high, that has adolescent onset transgender identity. Okay, and I say identification because that they self-identify at that before late adolescence. They're disproportionately female, about 80%. They have high rates of psychopathology. 60% of them have some kind of anxiety, depression, self-esteem, something going on. Their non-heterosexual identity is presented in about 40% of them. And again, I'm putting identity in quotes because what happens when you're 14 and you're looking around at the world and thinking about sex? Okay? Well, she's my best friend and kind of like what she's got going and I might be thinking about her. Maybe I'm gay, all right? And maybe you'll engage in sexual behaviors with, you know, homosexual behaviors, but they actually take that extra step and say, I am gay, I am straight, I am trans, I'm gay, I'm straight, I'm bi. And we ask kids, and this breaks my heart, we ask kids in 6th grade to figure out what their sexuality is. Oh my gosh, I am like an old woman. Okay, I'm not sure about my sexual self, okay? There's all sorts of details I'm not gonna go into, all right? But you know, that idiosexuality piece, that's really what it's all about in adulthood for me. There's other people who are like, no, I wanna be in polyamorous. And again, they might be struggling. So why do we encourage 6th and 7th graders to figure this out when there's such a high rate of homo and bisexual behavior? Also among this population, very high rates of in and out grouping based on whether you are identifying as trans. These trans girls have all sorts of trans girls groups and they all become trans and they all reinforce the trans identity in very high rates. And this also shares some of the social contagion features of eating disorders and non-suicidal cutting, where you see this perpetuation of body self-loathing through cyclical reassurance by your peers. Oh my God, I just hate my body. I am so gender dysphoric. Oh honey, you are. You know, there's gonna be some point when you're gonna be okay because you're gonna get some testosterone and you're gonna feel so much better. Okay, that's just like the, you know what, I just have to cut on myself. I know, it's the only thing that helps with the, you know, we're cutters, it's the only thing that works, all right? So you get this sort of cyclical perpetuation of body self-loathing, and that's not quite the same as, you know, body dysmorphia, body dysphoria. So what are my conclusions? Number 1, gender is uniquely human. Sorry, it's biology. It's culture, it's self-determined. What do we do to treat gender non-conforming children? And I, again, put this in quotes because It's not a disorder to be gender non-conforming child, okay? You avoid genderification because there's a 50-50 chance of persisting or desisting in puberty. You don't really need to differentiate, well, if you're a girl or a boy. I mean, 40 to 60%. How good are our statistics anyway? It's a 50-50 chance. Don't genderify your child. It is just as harmful to think about genderifying a child at 4 years old who says he's a girl, has male parts, and you start dressing him in those clothes and say, you're going to be a girl for the rest of your life, as it is to do the opposite. You will never be a girl, you're a boy, you need to act like a boy and behave like a boy. We need to be really even-handed about not genderifying these gender non-conforming children. In fact, I kind of think we shouldn't genderify anybody. Okay, I'm a big fan of school uniforms. You know why? If you keep school uniforms all the way through like middle school and nobody gets to wear skirts, gender's a lot less of an issue. Foster a flexibility of yourself in all domains. This is what Janet Hyde said. Shyness, differences in males and females, not really. Leadership, differences in males and females, no. Empathy, differences in male and females, no. Even being trans, okay? Differences in male and females, no. Don't get a child to get caught up in, I'm me, I know who I am, and I'm gonna be a thing forever. You teach self-protection, okay? You know what? When someone says, are you a boy or a girl? You know what? Private parts are private. Don't you know that? Okay? I'm 7 years old. I know that private parts are private. Leave me alone. I'm a kid. Okay? That's what all kids should say to that question. What about the gender non-conforming teens? Desexualize their relationships. Hey, you're going to fall in love with people, not parts. It's complicated. Don't worry about it. You know what? There's plenty of time. This is your time of exploration. You're going to fall in love with people, not parts. All right? Treatment, again, gender non-conforming teens. You don't have to decide whether you're poly or monogamous, okay, at 14 or at 16, all right? Monogamy is a choice, not a feeling. There's a lot of couples I work with, okay, that we spend a lot of time on that one, okay? Just because you're not having monogamous feelings doesn't mean you can't have, you get permission to have non-monogamous behaviors. There's a deal here you made about just being the two of you. And it doesn't matter that one partner is like, but I only feel for him, and the other partner is like, I feel for just about everybody. Okay? Monogamy is a choice. It's a commitment. It's a cultural, personal commitment. I should say it's a personal commitment that gets reinforced in culture. And again, how do we treat gender nonconforming children and teens? I do think our clinical interventions should be based on psychological science, okay? It has to include an understanding of the developmental capacity for self-awareness, all right? At 4, if you say you're a tiger, or at 4 you say you're a girl, I don't believe you, okay? I just don't believe you. And if you spend all this time acting like a tiger, okay, and by the time you're 7, you kind of get it that that's weird, okay, and you decide to not act like a tiger, that's fine. If you act like a girl, and then by the time you're 7, you're like, I kind of like this. I'm got male parts, but I like acting like a girl. That's fine too. But you don't say, oh, you're 6 years old and you know you're a girl. It's not different. And then the developmental phase of identity formation. I have to say, I am not opposed to experimenting, to trying, to encouraging, ways of dealing with this growing body that's changing a lot medically as you go through puberty. However, if you are going to do something that is irreversible, I do not see why you would give a child, a 13-year-old, permission to do something that's irreversible to their body.
What about, I know we're at
Alrighty,
but never mind.
Okay, and because I'm going to just finish up. All right, so here you go. Yes, you were born this way. Yes, you were raised this way. And yes, you are free to be you. So, ta-da! Questions. So, questions, comments?
In the sphere of gender-affirming treatment, I'm curious about your reactions to the whole idea of just postponing puberty and what that does, because even that raises questions for me. One of the arguments is it gives people more time to make those choices and to develop, but it does all kinds of things biologically that also can't be reversed necessarily.
Well, yeah.
So, and there just seems, anyway, I'm curious about your reaction.
And my take on it is, yeah, it's complicated. You're an adolescent and it's weird and you want to know what you're going to do and you want to try different things. But you know what? Delaying the challenge of trying to figure this out is just delaying it. And I would actually come back to saying, you know what? You're not fully cooked. You don't have to decide. You don't have an identity yet. All right? If you are 25 years old and you are quite solidly sure you want to be known to the world, or how old was Caitlyn Jenner? 48? Yeah, if you're 48 years old and you are quite certain you want to be known to the world as a woman and you have male biology, we can work that out for you. You don't need to decide at 13 years old. You don't need to decide at 11 to stop your puberty. You have plenty of time to be you over time. Let's just go through this struggle together and see what comes of it. Because you don't know who, and you hate to say to a kid, you don't know yourself. But you don't know yourself, okay? I barely know myself, all right? Anything else? Other comments, questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to the presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Also, welcome to public education.
I didn't even realize I was sitting next to her.
Oh, hi. How are you, Suzanne? Good, I didn't see you either.
You didn't either, huh? When I put my stuff down and
I'm in my little bubble.
It's good, we haven't seen each other in a long time.
I should inform us to be friendly and look
It looks like you're flourishing.
Well, I just came back from a month in Santa Fe. I'm fully retired. My husband just retired, so we're footloose and busy,
Okay.
but you know, also
I'm gonna get busy.
not.
Okay.
How about you?
That's fine, yeah, because I'm going to be only around, but grab me early because I am leaving.
Oh, good, that's helpful to know, that's
Yeah,
great, all right.
good with the more time,
As soon as
any
you get set up,
thoughts
if you're
about-
gone by then, it's fine, at least maybe we'll
Yeah,
finish
boy,
up,
that
you know, the
seems to
format, but
be the,
we're trying to get people, get
sort
this
of
stuff out to
operational
the general
type.
public
I did the
in a real
thing
simple way, so if you
yesterday,
think of ways,
and,
or groups or populations you'd like to target, I'd
the
love to
word
support you in
currency
any way to get
was
out
was
your
higher
neck of the woods and
Oh, yeah.
make it a thing, so.
Yeah, it would be great if we could get more stuff out there. And one of these things is just to turn off my camera here.
That's a good idea.